end up with enough ambivalence that might pave the way for some affirmations. So that's what I'm hoping, because I'm going to talk about some folks who wanted to take a piece of Marx, a fragment in fact, to start making sense of possibilities and thinking about the ways the struggles worked. So I also want to give a shout out to Matt, not just for thinking of this and organizing this, but he's made me think about how to read more carefully. Even though I'm not going to be able to read very carefully today, but to read text carefully, but also to read struggles very carefully, and those two things at the same time. And so I'm hoping that I can approach a little bit of that today. So thanks, Matt. Okay, so I also, as I recall, that one of the initial thoughts about how this program was going to work is that people were supposed to pick a particular bit of Marx and then kind of analyze it. So maybe I forgot all of that. Maybe I just misremembered. So I just picked the smallest thing that I could remember. No, but it's the fragment on machines. But so the reason I wanted to bring it up, but now given this conversation, it could go a different way, is to why study this now is actually an academic one almost. So I'm in the field of media and communication studies. And what I've been seeing is a rise of a kind of technology studies and a new media studies that has seemingly forgotten how to think about machines and technology in terms of struggle. And in fact, maybe actively negating that in light of what I would call a certain level of liberal technologists. Sometimes they're like moral sociologists, civil society warriors who seek networked publics in spheres to be cultivated through corporate consultation and reformist policymaking. Often seen in the phrase "Facebook do better." Like you can hear that tone in a lot of the kind of writings that come out of these spaces, and I'm not going to name names. Some of them are my friends, but the mechanisms, the field mechanisms, the institutional mechanisms, are places like Microsoft Research, Data and Society, Intel. So it's a way of like, how do we think about a particular tendency, perhaps becoming hegemonic in a field, and what that might occlude. So I think reviving the fragment then becomes a way of potentially addressing some of that. So the plan, I'm going to talk a little about the fragment. I just put this slideshow together. There's going to be a little too much text, I'm sorry. Key passages that get taken up by the heterodox tradition and Marxism from the 60s, aka aparaísmo, class composition, and then maybe some of the other kinds of tendencies that I find interesting in the field that also open up these questions of how do we understand struggles and machines. Okay, I didn't realize these were going to be so small here too, sorry. So the reason I wanted to have slides is because I wanted to get the key lines up here from the fragments, and that's why I needed that, but I'm not even going to go through those yet. Just a quick background on the fragments. The fragment comes out of the Grundrisse. Between 1857 and 1858, Marx fills these 7 notebooks with some thoughts and pieces, and he's thinking through some stuff, and it's in between the 1844 economic and philosophical manuscripts, the more kind of humanistic side, and well before the publication of Capital, volume of Capital, 1867. But the translation, it gets published posthumously as the Grundrisse almost a century later, so the 1950s, and it starts getting translated, and especially gets translated into Italian right around then. And the fragment is about 16 pages on this question of the machine. And so, but before we get into it, also, it's a moment that the text appears where a circulation of struggles is also happening. So in and around the 1968 eruptions, we start seeing a break with certain versions of orthodox or scientific Marxism, right? And these kind of traditional approaches of the scientific critique of political economy. So so people are looking for ways to not leave Marx, but not do the same Marx, the party Marx. And so we begin to see a kind of unorthodox or heterodox Marxism. The fragment, the Grundrisse generally, becomes the central text to reinvent the Marxist tradition, Marxian tradition. In Italy, this has then become known as going beyond Marx, Marx beyond Marx, right, in Negri's early and mid-70s work. So you're still with Marx, but pushing Marx. I also want to talk about the fragment before we get into it again. I like the way Ben Trott has talked about the fragment on machines as not related to science, but science fiction. And what he says about how that works, that genre works, right, is that you're taking some techno-scientific tendencies and actualities that are happening and trying to project a future and to understand the possibilities that are happening in this kind of analysis of the present that has logical possibilities. So it's speculative, right? So it's not going to be empirically grounded in the same way as science might be. So it's speculative amidst a set of emerging developments, right? And the emergence is what's important. It's like we don't know yet what these bodies can do. We don't know yet what these machines can do. And it's tied up with the imaginable. What is imaginable now? How did the fragment begin to set up some imaginable things, and also around utopia and dystopia, which is some of the things we've been talking about, I think, today, whether or not we've mentioned it that way, about what the machines can produce. I also want to put this in the context, I kind of already said it when I mentioned Matt's work, but in the way that we read theory, in the way that Harry Cleaver says that, you know, autonomous Marxism should be read. It's a political reading of Marx. It's how does Marx help in understanding the contemporary state of the struggles and the forms of struggle that can happen, right? It's not about accuracy. It's not about everyone's everyday life, but it's specifically about the forms of nature and concepts of struggle itself. So, okay, so that's kind of framing. So my selection of these is already, you know, predetermined by the fact that I'm going to talk about the Italian autonomous around it. So the three lines that I wanted to highlight, and also highlighted some of the words that get taken up, right? Objectified labor. We've heard versions of this already today, so some of this won't be new. But some of the key phrases might be: objectified labor materially confronts living labor as a ruling power and as an active subsumption of the latter under itself. Right, so this idea of subsumption becomes a very crucial one for the autonomous, as we'll see, which ultimately means the way they end up talking about it. Yes, everything is really subsumed under capital. It's real subsumption, but that totality is not a system that negates completely and just remains stasis. It actually reproduces struggle in all these different sites. So the idea of the subsumption isn't a neutralization of the conflict. Okay, the second line, the accumulation of knowledge and of skill and of the general productive forces of the social brain, right? That's the key word. The social brain is thus absorbed into capital as opposed to labor. And that's important. Absorbed into capital as opposed to labor. Not necessarily in difference to or difference from labor, but opposed to. Hence appears, we talked about appearance, right, as an attribute of capital, and more specifically of fixed capital. So it appears as an attribute opposed to labor. And then the third one, the conditions of the process of social life itself have come under the control of the general intellect and have been transformed in accordance with it. Okay, so why do these, to sort of summarize, I think, what the key elements of this. One is that at an abstraction level, right? So technology is not a tool for workers, but I should step back, right? For the Italians, capitalism is not a system, it's a social relationship between capital and labor. And it's that dynamic that motors history. So there is no capitalism as such. It is a constant navigation of that relationship. And that relation is antagonistic, right? So it's a hostile one. So that's where you get some of this idea of confrontation starts emerging from this. So technology is not a tool in a system, but it's a moment in a process and a relationship. So this is why Marx talks about objectification, accumulation of knowledge, subsumption, these practices, these processes, right, that are happening. And that what gets subsumed is living labor. So we talked briefly just before this about labor power, right? And so one of the things that the Italians tend to focus on is the difference between labor power and living labor, and how living labor gets turned into labor power for capital. But that there's something else besides labor power that we can call living labor that's closer to species being, for instance. Okay, so I'm just trying to map some things now, right? Okay, so living labor is subsumed. So labor becomes a supervisor, a link, subordinated to the machine. So that's the first one, right? Technology is not a tool. Second one is an antagonistic relationship. So this accumulation becomes alien to and external to labor, right? It's not just capitalism's contradiction that's happening around this, but it's what maybe even nowadays economists would call externalities, right? I mean, it's something that is actually, but it's a hostile externality. Okay, and then finally, something I think we were just talking about, especially with the rise of internet and other digital online forms of interaction is that this idea of the general intellect is that capital begins increasingly to rely on sociality itself, social relations, the combination of the social to produce intellect, the brain, right? But it then expands for the Italians to things like affect, right? So all these things become really subsumed under capital. But then we'll see where that might go. Okay, so those are the lines. Why this matters for operaismo or autonomous Marxism is that their interest is in not the composition of capital necessarily. I mean, there's a lot. That's the scientific approach in Marx, right? To figure out how capital actually operates scientifically, figure out the formulas, where the contradictions are, and then see what opens up there. But instead, they're interested in the composition of class itself, and they have two dimensions to this, which is the technical composition and the political composition of a class. The technical composition would be something more like the organization or the material structure of the working class, the conditions under which the class is a class. But on the other hand, the political composition is something a little more open. This is where the autonomia comes from. The autonomous history of something like living labor as a subject, the forms it develops, the forms it can self-organize around are tied to, but not reducible to technical composition, the political composition that is. So is not tied to that. Okay, so the key figure, I would say, who then begins to take the fragment and start trying to put it to work differently is Paolo Virno. And so Virno says, he starts writing, 70s, 80s, like, look, post-Fordism has taken this prediction or this sort of tendency that Marx located, and it has realized it. Right, so all the value is now spread throughout the entirety of the social, the value extraction, that the computerization of the factory is part of that kind of accumulation of the social brain in the factory. And that the society, again, is being subsumed. But he says the move we need to make is that Marx did not make for the general intellect, is that general intellect for Marx is still the accumulation in objective machinery. That Marx didn't do was to look at it from the perspective of living labor. That is, to take the dynamic. That too often Marx would end up thinking about capital in its own composition and would not look at labor as a separate and antagonistic force in the relationship. So in that case, what Virno has to say is like we need to move to that subjective dimension and not just the objective dimension of general intellect. So this is when he starts saying, the range of things now that are part of valorization, formal and informal knowledges, imagination, ethical inclinations, mentalities, language games. Self-reflexivity itself is now part of it, right, he says. So let me just see where we are. Okay. And what this opens up, a couple of things which end up being kind of problematic. For one thing, it allows this group of Italians to start thinking about all these different forms of value production that weren't typically seen within kind of orthodox Marxism. So, for instance, it's productive labor, it's non-productive labor, right? The ones who, the sort of lumpen proletariat, as well as the reproductive labor. So they begin to expand the idea of where value is created, what labor is, by going to the productive, unproductive, and reproductive. And here then, and this is where it gets sometimes a little dodgy, and Sylvia's right, that some of those folks ended up saying, well, what we need to look at is the most advanced sector of the labor force. So the highly technologized side. And this is where you're going to find the heightened antagonism is in the moment where they are most reduced to the machine, to the expansion of the machine and the social cooperation. So the cognitariat becomes one of these terms. Although I would say later the cognitariat, even based on the things we've been talking about, the cognitariat can be anyone who's producing value through their information techniques or through their practices, right, or through their intellect. By being online, by liking something, you're already involved in cognitive labor. So it was and it can be the most highly advanced sector, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that. But moreover, the idea, and this comes most clearly through Antonio Negri, is the idea of social cooperation. That what capitalism needs increasingly is social cooperation itself, and then and not just thoughts and affects, but the combination of those, the ways that the social increases the value of any thought or any affect by actually increasing it through the combination, through the interaction, through the circulation of it. Right? So this is where then we start seeing ideas of a new proletariat, all those whose labor is exploited by capital, which is basically everyone, but the entire cooperating multitude, right? So that's where one of the histories of that term comes from. But, and here's, to go back to one of the questions of optimism, pessimism. So Negri is accused a lot of times of too much optimism. It's always like, comrades, we have finally reached the moment where everything, I know, yeah, can you not see? Yeah, this is the moment where you can reclaim and reappropriate the very machines that have subdued us, right? So, so this is where it's like, because social cooperation is so necessary to capital, and capital relies on a socially cooperative labor force, that's the moment where it could be a basis for the reappropriation of those very techniques and means of production for something else, for instance, the commons, right? So that's typically the Negrian move to turn the thing that becomes real subsumption into all spaces can now be spaces of reappropriation in the commons. Okay, at the same time, I also want to shout out to folks like Nick Dyer-Witherford and George Kafensis, who have also noted that some of that idea of the cognitorium still depends on a globally distributed workforce that is extractive and that, both in terms of the labor, in terms of the resources as well. So, that all those things need to be kind of put in conversation with each other. And then I will also mention now, and I'll say a little bit more about her later, Leopoldina Fortunati, who's worked on some things around social reproduction and technology, specifically domestic technologies. It's a shout out to something that was published some time ago, but I edited a special issue of Journal of Communication Inquiry on the 10-year anniversary of Empire. Ron and Matt had a co-authored piece in it, and Leopoldina has a piece in it too about ICTs and domestic technologies. And so I think, her work is quite fascinating on both the ways that's used to control women, but also those possibilities that now arise based around technology and domesticity and social reproduction. Okay, so the contemporary relevance then, okay, I will try to go this quickly. And we've heard many of these already. So one is, the way I see people now try to employing some of these insights, not necessarily from the autonomous, but just from the fragment to contemporary labor issues. One is the gig economy, right? So what I just want to mention Uber drivers because my colleague at Rutgers, Todd Wolfson, who is a trained anthropologist, is doing a kind of ethnography of Uber drivers in Philadelphia. And one of the things he's trying to examine is that while this decompositional effort is being made, or disaggregation, the way that Sylvia was talking about it, of laborers, that you become solo drivers, even though cabbies were typically solo drivers too, but that you're tied to the app, and to a kind of feedback mechanism with the company that isolates people. He's looking at where the Uber drivers kind of the point of gathering, where they do hang out, exchange tips, exchange, watch my app while I go do this. So there's this whole ways of kind of creating a little bit of at least their own version of a kind of reproduction in there, and it may be a potential site for organizing. So for Todd, this is always the crucial thing. Is like, how do we organize at these points of disaggregation? So I would just mention that kind of gig economy work, which is kind of an extension of this. Oh, but the other gig economy thing that hasn't been brought up that I find also really interesting in my field is the idea of the influencer online, the social media influencer. This is also a kind of way that machines instrumentalize sociality itself, right? And I would just point people to the work of Brooke Duffy and Betsy Wissinger, who've talked about the emotional labor, self-branding labor, and entrepreneurial labor of influencers, and how then and they talk to them, right? And they're talking to influencers and micro celebrities to see, like, do they think of their work as labor, and what are some of the I think these kinds of studies need to also be long-term, because you get somebody on the entrepreneurial moment, they're like, yeah, it's great, I got all these followers, awesome. Talk to people like a year or two later, when, like with many young people, you start finding burnout and limits, and then it's like, oh, yeah, it wasn't what I thought it was. I mean, the Michelle Phan case is a classic one of the top bloggers who then gets exhausted, gets upset with YouTube's policies, and withdraws. She comes back in a different way. But the idea that like these things are somehow smooth processes, I think, is one of the things that work like Brooke and Betsy's show us that they aren't easily successful, right? So there's a failure in subjectivity in some of these. So and that might be one of the places to look actually for solidarities is failures and exhaustion and the care work that has to happen when this version of labor actually doesn't succeed. So to move to that, so the first one is gig economy. The second one is social reproduction. Leopoldina's work, Ursula Hughes has done some really great work on the cybertarian, but is primarily from the perspective of domestic technologies. And I would really encourage people to look at Elise Thorburns' work on digital social reproduction and the work of social networks, but also network technologies as a contradiction, and that social reproduction of the capital-labor relation is because that relationship is also antagonistic. One needs to think about, and at least follows Sylvia on this, right, that the struggle against that relation, the struggle against capital, also needs its own social reproduction. And so she examines the work that this kind of dual work that social reproduction does. And what she points to is that there's a crisis in social reproduction, that it doesn't always produce the laborers that need to go, right? So to look at places where failure takes place, she looks at the, anxiety, panic, and depression as the kind of dominant affects. Oh, that tells me I'm running out before I got the thing. But okay, so that even if our intimacies are fully subsumed, we have these things again don't create. I should say it's neither necessarily the optimism of a Negri, but it's not necessarily one could say that like the pessimism of a Franco Berardi or something to think about that we're just exhausted, we're just sort of like moving through. But the recomposition that can happen in these sites of social destruction, social bonds destruction, the recreation of them might be a place to look for, if not hope, at least where things are actually just happening, where people are organizing, whether or not they're organizing around labor necessarily is one question. So I would also point to some of the work, even though Carrie Rentschler is not, is not necessarily involved in autonomous Marxism, but the way she's talked about the digital sphere as a sphere of bystander intervention and witnessing, and she wrote this before Me Too, but I think people have sort of picked up on the idea of like about solidarity networks in and around and against rape culture that have been going on for some time, and so she wants to look at some of that. So we think about where social reproduction might be happening. I'm working on warfare, but I'll jump over that. I can talk about that later if you want. But it's not just me. Two of these folks, Eric Alliez and Maurizio Lazzarato, wrote a book recently called Wars and Capital, where they're trying to figure out, they're looking at the imbrication of those two around primitive accumulation specifically, right? That capital emerges basically through a war on women and through colonial wars. Essentially, right? But that war is constitutive of capital. The capital, as they say, is not just a mode of production, it is inherently a mode of destruction. And so to figure out what we can do around that, to build what they say are war machines. So I just had a little fragment on war machines thing, just to remind myself I should do something on fragment on war machines. Okay, so I just call it that. Okay, so I want to end with this quote and then say something. I change this conclusion because not everybody's interested in the academic subfield that I'm in. But okay, so the quote is from Hart Negri in Assembly. In the multitude that resists capitalist power, the old and the new live together in a kind of interregnum, right? They're drawing off of Gramsci's quote. So that old unraveling political composition, right? So the political composition is not what we used to think it was, right? We've been talking about that. Like, what are the forms of activism? How do we think about that old one unraveling, but a new emergent one, a technical one, is still happening? So how can we imagine that future in the way that Marx did in The Fragment, to think about a kind of science fiction that actually can help organize and think about the ways we organize our struggles? Thanks.
right. So, the concept in my title of cramped spaces is very much indebted to Matt, and it's sort of a shorthand term that we started using about 1.5 years ago that emerged from conversations we were having about how to find political possibility and revolutionary potential within spaces of extreme political repression. And so this is sort of my very humble attempt to end on a note of at least attempting to determine where to look to find possibility. All right. So Marx's capital is riddled with movement. Commodities clash with other commodities, new goods migrate across space in relation for money, and social relations between people, time, and labor power are pushed and pulled with the introduction of machines. However, this movement is premised on a certain amount of fixed capital, or any kind of real physical asset that is used in the production of a product, but is not actually used up during the production process. Fixed capital is the portion of the total capital outlay that is invested in fixed assets, such as land improvements, buildings, roads, vehicles, or plant equipment, that stay in the business almost permanently, or at least for more than one accounting period. For global exchange and accumulation to happen, bridges and train tracks must exist for goods to repeatedly move across space. Data servers comprised of material cords must be situated for the circulation of currency. The global order of capitalism demands constant movement and circulation, yet it also requires periods, objects, and spaces of stasis. Fixed capital creates a material scaffold within which necessary movements, circulations, and exchanges happen to reproduce capital and generate accumulation. Contemporary social movements are largely oriented around struggles over fixed capital. For instance, the Standing Rock protests were an objection to the insertion of environmentally disastrous fixed capital in the form of an oil pipeline on native sovereign land. Over the past year, truck drivers in California have gone on strike to protest the fact that trucking companies force drivers to lease their trucks from the company and pay for the repairs. These strikes are an objection to the company's failure to provide the fixed capital necessary to carry out a job, instead displacing that burden onto the worker, a phenomenon that can certainly be found in other workplaces, as I think we've talked about today. In Palestine, Israel often refuses the importing of raw materials, such as gravel and cement, to Gaza and the West Bank for Palestinians to rebuild basic material infrastructures, such as buildings and roads. So fundamentally, Israel is denying Palestinians access to fixed capital as a mechanism of colonization and dispossession. Antonio Negri argues, quote, "Today's social terrain is shaped by technological transformations. That is to say that movements qualify and develop themselves in terms of appropriation of fixed capital. At present, everywhere we look, from urban struggles to worker struggles and environmental ones, we see the desire to control fixed capital. We could say then that contemporary movements are entrepreneurial movements, technological entrepreneurship, entrepreneurship of the multitude, entrepreneurship of the common. A social movement today wants to control the common, to hold it, and to manage it," end quote. Indeed, to control and manage the commons, we must control the material infrastructure through which the commons survives, regenerates, reproduces, and reasserts a different mode of production and new ways of being together. However, rather than only seeing fixed capital as just something to fight, to control, or respond to, I want to posit that social movements and collective struggles should actually utilize fixed capital in moments of rebellion, taking it over within that moment of rupture as a tool for collective governance. To explicate this proposition, I turn to the Attica prison uprising of 1971 as an example in which dispossessed prisoners utilized fixed capital as a means to interrupt the continuation of a violent and exploitative prison system. As the Attica prison uprising demonstrates, relationally engaging with fixed capital in moments of uprising can create an instance in which flows of capital accumulation are momentarily shut down, thus enabling different use values to emerge under collective governance. I know this is a historical example, but I think it's a really good one. So that's why I'm using it, and I think we can use it to think through things like Occupy and everything else. The shift from exchange value to use value is a constitutive element of socialist governance, which enables a reimagining and reenactment of how we might relate to one another in the material world around us. As such, identifying moments of rupture in which the shift momentarily takes place offers insight into how collective struggles might strategically engage or instigate this transference as a tool in the struggle against capitalism. Through this analysis of the Attica prison uprising, I offer an assessment of how explicit engagement with fixed capital and other material objects or built environments clarifies how the compositional power of collective struggles today might unfold in ways that irreversibly damage the logics of capture in which rebellious potential emerges. First, I argue that the material arrangement of fixed capital carries rhetorical power that comes to bear on subject formation. Second, I position the materiality of the prison as a form of fixed capital due to its integral role in managing and containing the surplus population within the United States. And finally, I turn to the Attica prison uprising as an example, focusing in particular on how the prisoners' temporary expropriation of the prison transformed the way they interacted with each other and the material objects around them over the course of their 4-day occupation. So first, fixed capital. So as the material scaffolding of our society, fixed capital comes to bear on our subject formation, as roads guides how both goods and people travel across land and water, as the specific constructions of buildings chaperone how people walk through and interact with one another, and as algorithms fire through material data servers to make certain kinds of information available to us. Buildings, building repairs, roads, data centers, and other built environments are fixed capital as these infrastructures are necessary for production, but don't get used up in the production process. Yet, fixed capital is not made up of merely utilitarian infrastructures for capital accumulation. Fixed capital comes to bear on our subject formation, as the construction of roads might impact how we interact with the land in that place. In literatures on new materialism, get at precisely this. Similar arguments emerge in rhetorical approaches to space and place, a subfield premised on the conviction that the material environment, its arrangement, and the effective attachments it produces function as powerful arguments within contemporary cultural politics. For instance, in her commentary on how space produces social power, Raka Shom argues that space is not merely a backdrop against which the communication of cultural politics occurs, but rather it functions as a technology, a means and a medium of power that is socially constituted through material relations that enable the communication of specific politics. So the materiality of space is a communicative technology in and of itself, and its contours shape the affordances and constraints of communicative practices in a given context. So Shom is right. Space is not merely a backdrop, but rather, as I argue, a necessary mechanism in the maintenance and reproduction of capital. So within the context of incarceration, the materiality of the prison itself can be understood as fixed capital. Indeed, the infrastructure of the prison is a physical asset that is used in the production of a product, but not used up in production. And the product of the prison under capitalism, I would argue, at least in the United States, is the prisoner. In the United States, the massive incarcerated population makes up a key constituency of the surplus population, an integral cog in the capitalist machine. As Marx details in Capital, without a surplus population, labor shortages would create upward pressure on wages and increase union power. Further, the existence of the surplus population functions as a disciplinary force for those in the workforce, through producing the fact that someone or anyone could replace you at your job at any given moment, since there's always an unemployed mass seeking stable work. As Marx states, the, quote, relative surplus population is the pivot upon which the law of demand and supply of labor works, end quote. Thus, the infrastructure of the prison itself can be understood as a form of fixed capital in the sense that it is, in effect, an infrastructure which enables the production of a segment of the surplus population. The prison is also a key infrastructure with which the state mediates and suppresses class conflict. Pulling from Engels, Lenin states and state and revolution, quote, ignore that. The state is the product and the manifestation of the irreconcilability of class antagonisms. The state arises when, where, and to the extent that the class antagonisms cannot be objectively reconciled. And conversely, the existence of the state proves that the class antagonisms are irreconcilable, end quote. For Lenin, the state is an organization of violence for the suppression of some class. In the United States, the prison is an expression of bourgeois state power in motion, as understandings of criminality are mobilized as a means to violently suppress the proletariat when class conflict arises. So to turn to Attica now. Over the course of their occupation, the Attica Prison Liberation Faction, which is what they named themselves, transformed how the prisoners interacted with the fixed capital of state violence. So over the course of 4 days, the inmates confined to one recreational yard reached an astounding level of self-organization to meet basic needs and democratically organized demands for negotiations with prison administration. At the beginning of the occupation, one inmate proclaimed to the men via bullhorn to eliminate the fights amongst ourselves and focus our hostility outside. This call for solidarity was realized through the ways in which the prisoners interacted with the objects around them. On the most basic level, instead of utilizing prison walls as a mechanism for separation and containment, the prisoners transformed the prison walls into a material fortress of collectivity and protection from state violence as they congregated together in Prison Yard D, which was the specific yard that they were in, socially reorganizing themselves under extreme constraints. The prisoners all gave up their collected weapons of baseball bats, makeshift knives, and pieces of wood and iron, and piled them under a picnic table near the front of the yard. Another prisoner versed in electrical work set up a speaker system so they could all communicate. Prisoners with medical experience obtained supplies from the prison hospital to treat injuries and chronic illnesses, and another group of men volunteered to take care of feeding everyone with food from the prison commissary. After basic needs were taken care of, they held an election. The members of each cell block elected 2 men to vote on all important decisions. Fairly quickly, the prison yard was transformed into a formally governed space with a designated security force, a dining area, a medical station, and democratically elected representatives. Because of this transformation, the Attica Prison Liberation Faction offers insight into how to shift the relations to themselves, the material objects around them, and the built environment they were occupying by momentarily expropriating the fixed capital of the prison. While some of these micro-compositional practices, such as food and medical care, are merely instances of meeting the basic needs necessary to sustain life, they take on a political and constitutive meaning in the context of a collective uprising. Silvia Federici offers a helpful framework for making sense of this through the conceptualization of self-reproducing movements, or social movements that prioritize the reproduction of their members. Federici argues that commoning practices, wherein individuals collectivize spaces and resources, are a mechanism through which collectives can confront the divisions that have been planted among the lines of race, gender, age, geographic location, etc. In the context of prison, the most potent divisions are likely to fall along the divisions of race, political affiliation, and/or gang affiliation. As Federici highlights, attending to the daily needs of the members of a collective sets the foundation for a political framework that understands members' lives in a more holistic way. Federici argues that this is necessary as the general social fabric fails to meet basic needs in so many ways, thus causing crisis through lack of access to housing, food, and fair wages. This is especially true in the context of a prison where access to basic goods such as water, soap, food, toilet paper are severely limited as a form of punishment and discipline. In her explication of the commoning of reproductive practices, Federici states, quote, "It is one thing to organize communally the way we want to eat, by ourselves or in groups, and then to ask the state to pay for it. And it is the opposite thing to ask for the state to organize our meals. In one case, we regain some control over our lives, and in the other, we extend the state's control over us," end quote. I would argue that the Attica Prison Liberation Faction offers a slight modification for thinking about people's governance, which is to expropriate the resources we need from the state and organize communally. There is no asking involved. The class antagonisms are irreconcilable. Beyond meeting basic needs necessary to sustain life, the Attica Prison Liberation Faction reimagined and reenacted new ways of being in relation to one another and their environment. During the occupation, the Liberation Faction would send prisoners out to a tunnel where they could communicate with prison officials and where various political actors and journalists would pass through to visit and negotiate with the prisoners. Especially in the tunnel, the prisoners knew they were vulnerable and that the officials on the other side of the bars could attack them at any time. The prisoners utilized a variety of materials as makeshift armor. Recreational football helmets, usually utilized as a tool for play and physical fitness in the prison, were instead utilized as armor against state violence. Baseball bats became another tool for protection, and shreds of bed sheets and clothing with cut-out eye slits were used to cover their faces. Out in the prison yard, the picnic tables became stages for agitational speeches, diplomatic meetings with political representatives from the outside world, and a space where prisoners collectively struggled over what to include in their manifestos. Beds were pulled out of cells and used to create a designated area for the hostages, a sort of micro-prison for the class disciplinarians who the prisoners wanted to keep safe for bargaining purposes. The material objects I point to, football helmets, prison mattresses, baseball bats, and picnic tables, are mundane, and perhaps they seem insignificant insofar as we consider them as specific mechanisms for the maintenance of the prison as a whole. Yet they are, in fact, necessary material objects for the micro-reproduction of the prison. Yet within the context of an uprising, these objects take on a different use based on the object's physical properties or use value. The prison as a whole is momentarily removed from circuits of capital due to the prisoners' refusal to maintain their position as a violently repressed surplus population. As the prison walls transform from their function as a means of state violence by imposing separation and containment to a mode of protection from state violence, new use values emerge for other, smaller material objects located within the context of the prison. To be clear, it's not that these use values didn't exist before. Indeed, it's hardly surprising to consider a baseball bat as a means of protection. These use values were always already present, but obscured by the privileging of the exchange value of the object, which takes precedent under bourgeois state power. However, when the material space in which an object exists is momentarily removed from circuits of capital via a momentary rupture or rebellion, these other use values are able to come to the forefront as the exchange value temporarily melts away. Thus, the use value of an object is determined not only by the physical qualities of that object, but also through how a specific context enables certain physical qualities to emerge in more overt ways, ultimately contributing to a construction of a new kind of value universe. Thus, everyday objects, some of which are fixed capital, take on different use values in moments of rupture or rebellion. Here, we could also think about Palestinian right of return protesters who, while agitating at the border wall separating them from their homeland, ignite rubber tires to create a wall of smoke, making it more difficult for Israeli bullets to hit them. In this instance, the rubber tires take on a different use value as a mechanism of protection rather than a form of fixed capital necessary for a vehicle to travel within the context of an anti-colonial rebellion. The shift from exchange value to use value is a constitutive element of socialism or of people's governance. By identifying and utilizing different use values, individuals are able to enact, through micro-compositional practices, forms of governance different from those imposed by the bourgeois state. In the case of Attica, these different use values emerged to the temporary expropriation of the materiality of the prison, the fixed capital for the construction, maintenance, and discipline of a major segment of the surplus population. By momentarily halting flows of capital accumulation that run through the prison, the Attica Prison Liberation Faction was able to reimagine and reenact new ways of being together in relation to one another, the material objects around them, and their built environment. Thank you.
Yay.
So we'll spend about 20 minutes and take questions across the papers that were just presented, and then we'll use the time that we have remaining for more global stuff, and then turn things over.
So thank you both. Those were terrific papers. Jack, a question. You were individual's perspective. I'm doing it. Oh my goodness. But there's also a lot of stuff on the burgeoning of the further articulation of the industry and the market. So then what you've got is the market niche. So now you have all these companies that are coming into existence to provide support to the, we will do your fulfillments. We will make sure you're covered so you can take a vacation. Have you slept? Do we need to bring you some food? There's all these additional businesses that have come. So if you're looking at it not from the individual's point of view, but from the point of view of the industry, it's becoming larger and ever more articulated with all these market gaps and holes filled in.
That's fascinating. That's good to know, because the stories, the sort of news accounts are about the influencers who try to do all that on their own, right? They're trying to convince hotels and resorts that, like, hey, if you let me stay for free, I'm sponsored, so I'll give you great ratings. And but the idea of support. So this is for successful influencers,
even
or burgeoning
small.
ones?
So it's like the people I've read about. They're like agents or something. It's
Right.
like they'll keep their eyes out. They'll see somebody that they think is like going to be hot and could thrive and survive over time, and they'll come and ever more additional services can get offered, and then building out service organizations that might need to be built to like the fulfillment. You could serve multiple influencers with one fulfillment organization and that kind of thing.
That's fascinating. I mean, I also find it fascinating. Again, it's kind of an individual thing, although it's a trend among them, right? To create fake sponsorships, right? To generate the idea like, oh, I'm valuable because I'm hashtagging all these companies, and they're actually not being sponsored.
Are they hearing back? Are the companies going after them with cease and desist orders?
I don't know. Can you cease and desist a hashtag?
They cease and desist everything. Often it has there's no merit to it. It's nothing. But you can cease and desist anything.
But if they're acting like they're advertising a brand, then they're still doing they might still be doing some sort of work for that company. It's one thing to say, like, I'm horrible and I hate the company, I'm going to make them seem like they like my anti-Semitic stuff. It's different if they're just trying to act like they're already in the game. They're giving away for free is the problem.
But there could be trademark dilution, so it's illegal to use a trademark in a way that gives a different image from what the people who own the trademark wanted to give. So when you teach it, the classic example is if you had Mickey Mouse raping somebody, Walt Disney would get upset. Who's to say that your social media influencer, that could easily be a charge of trademark dilution, be treated as illegal.
Then what's that mean?
No, I'm saying that if they were like pro-Disney
But
and acted like they wanted people to think that they were connected to Disney, so they just did exactly what someone who was actually being supported by Disney.
So I'm explaining that if Disney didn't like that guy,
Oh, sure, of course, they can do whatever they want.
it would be
I'm just saying,
illegal.
couldn't stop them from doing it.
well, they would get a cease and desist and they could be stopped
I mean,
legally.
after they did it.
I just like the fact that the kind of cleverness, this is one of the things that Fortunati talks about, right, is that social reproduction today, she says it's called like social reproduction, but not as we know it. One of the things she says that specifically women have developed is a whole, métis, right, a whole set of skills and affects based on the kind of woman's work that's supposed to be done. So it's like cleverness, right, ability to sort of like get beyond obstacles. So I find this to be an interesting, this specific case about the fake sponsorships to even be a case of, okay, I'm not getting, right now it's still in the service of I want to be a successful influencer. But to think about those skills is not necessarily in the service of brand expansion and brand value, but that it could be done with, something else can be done with those skills. And they're coming from somewhere else. They're not coming from brand loyalty. Yeah.
So it's Kate. So prison. So in terms of seeing it as a site, well, could you tell me again what you said at the beginning about you were going to use the prison as an example to show what about potential? Is it potential forms of resistance? I couldn't remember how you phrased it.
I'm not sure exactly what phrase you were talking about, but for thinking about how spaces of intense repression, like what can emerge in those spaces actually? Like how do we locate life and resistance in those spaces, even if it's only momentarily, right?
Okay.
Like the thing that I didn't get to in here is how the Attic Prison Rebellion ended, which was like with the death of 40 people, right?
Yeah.
So.
But that's okay.
It's funny,
It's not okay, but
in
it's
context
okay.
of our discussion.
So okay, thank you. And so I just wanted to ask you to look at two aspects or compare two aspects. So one is the effect on revealing to other people something about the nature of the institution itself, as in, for instance, let's say we took over the radio station, back in the day, something like this, and then you use it for a different purpose. So it's a public function. And then the other one, which is kind of what you focused on, is how do we reimagine the use value of specific things that we're familiar with, right? Personally, that's internal. So, for instance, it goes back to go back to zombie shows for a second. One of the fun of zombie shows is we're always reimagining the usefulness of things, right? Because we're using them to kill zombies, we're using them to build things, and that's always fun. Just like my kids like it when the power goes out because everything becomes new, right? So, how do you? Is there a relationship between those two, or is it separated?
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked this question because I've been struggling with it because I can only make sense of them in relation to each other because I think what I don't want this argument to slip into is just people simply using things differently, right? Like what's important to me here is that they were using things differently for collective governance, like within a very specific context, and that could only happen within the context of, I think, an institution of fixed capital where they're kind of expropriating this larger whole and then reimagining micro ways of being within it.
Okay, so could it be said that, and this gets to more human nature as opposed to institution, doesn't reimagine the prison as a prison, it reimagines the people in the prison as human beings capable of self-governance, right? That we would normally think of as not. Would that be a fair generalization?
Yeah, I think
okay. So it's more about oh, those people suck, they couldn't do anything, but then they did, which says well, people can actually do that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Also, the differentiation that you just made, I think it's important to differentiate what you're talking about from condos agenda, which is again,
Right.
Right.
It's funny that I refer to condo that point to you.
So wait, so are you saying that it's not so much that it's the nature of the space, it's any place in which there are people whose agency is undervalued, or so the Paris Commune, right?
Correct.
It's not the city of Paris is not is a space of repression, but when you look at the people who take over, and
That's right.
so you're saying there's more similarities than differences between them.
That's right.
And in this case, it's such an extreme case of it seems like there's no agency. What could you possibly do in a prison?
Yeah.
And even there, not even there, but especially there, right? You can reappropriate and transform it. And so I think if we see that, then all these other spaces that seem enclosed and cramped simply have possibilities, and that's a human. Moment. So this is one of the pieces I mentioned, Ben Trott, when he talks about Fragment as science fiction, he ends on talking about the blockade and the blockage as a technique that actually opens things up, and specifically because capital now relies so much on logistics and supply chains. It's like the places. It's not the workplace where labor happens necessarily, but it's where capital has to move as well. And so so to be able to block some of that doesn't just interrupt capital; it actually interrupts the ability of fixed capital to remain fixed, and it opens up possibilities that say, oh, this can be done. We can reappropriate this and turn it into a commons, even if it's temporary commons. And the accumulation of those events and those moments then becomes the thing that is, if not optimistic, at least it's just, I mean, for Negri, that's working class history. If you know working class history, there are defeats for sure, but it's never a kind of totalizing system that neutralizes activity and activism. So what we need to do is reactivate the memory of these, not even that long ago, but reactivate even contemporary ones, or very recent ones too, to say like what's happening in them is a kind of power that's being developed within them that is beyond that concrete instance.
Yeah, that reminds me of like post-plague, 1378, the Trumpy Rebellion in Florence, right? That's the workers taking over the commune, and then the Peasants' Rebellion later on in England and in Germany. Right, those were all suppressed and they were turned back into serfs and slaves. But nonetheless, that was a reimagining of what the Republic cities were, and it was immediately crushed when the lower class sold out the working class. Right.
But also, like in spaces, because this is the whole thing about the autonomia model of thinking about capital as always responding to labor, right? It doesn't do things. We it's so hard. We all probably have, I'm sure, run into this problem of personifying capital when we're talking about this to students and stuff. But that the idea that it responds, and we think about the commune, right? But what we know of is Paris with all of the boulevards, right? Those were all built. So what they had to do is they had to plow these spaces of flows so they could, right? They were originally all connected to barracks so that they could stop it. So it reorganizes the space. But then you think putting big, fast flowing spaces may help capital, but it also may help people's ability to move. It changes the idea of a city and allows for a kind of anonymity. People are moving too, right? So there's this constant ebb and flow back and forth between these spaces and stuff. So I thought the space thing was really great.
Yeah. It reminds me also, I'm trying to think of these sort of limit cases, like the cramped space of the car that's dropping off the Amazon packages, the mom and her child, right? And what's happening in that car as she's doing it? The kid is doing homework, sure.
But that's a really important moment.
Yeah.
Right.
Like what else might be happening? Is the kid saying, "Mom, what are we doing? Why are we doing this?"
No.
Yeah.
And the one we talked to, she was just like, "This is great. I don't have to talk to anybody. I just
have.
push this button and I show up, and they put it in my car with a little number, and then we hang out. Like her son has to sit in the car for an hour and a half and do his damn homework too, right? It's like there's not looking at YouTube for like an hour. You could think about all of these little weird ways, and if I'm a parent, I can think of like, okay, I'm going to make an extra $400 a month, and that's going to make all the difference. It's going to do maybe things for the kid, or it's going to do things for something else, but I'm also going to capture this little space of time, even though it's also a space of exploitation, but it's a place where we're producing this relation with the child. And it's well, not as like work. I mean, it could be positive. Like you get to have it's what she wants. It's the good one. It's the good kind of work.
But who's doing it and where and why in that space? Why do you have to capture that time? Why do you have to and the only way you can do it is to use a fossil fuel, right? And that's it's like, we're gonna have our special time, but it won't be very much special time for anybody else for a long time. But down the line, so it's just like, what's the trade-off of these? Of the coping of the Peruk moment, right? Of like making do in those spaces of cramped capital. But I just wonder, like, at what point is there something else going to happen, like on other? Do the drivers ever talk to each other? Like, or is this network so?
The woman who tried to call the general strike with Lyft last week was interviewed, and she said that there are spaces. So like the place mostly would be like the airport,
right.
And there's a couple places by hotels, and there are places that the Lyft drivers know that they can associate. But other than that, right, this, like you said, the system disaggregates their ability to communicate, but that their response is to find spaces, right, to find collective spaces. And I'm sure forums online and stuff is where all of this is really happening too.
But is they like this labor? Because my child is doing the homework in the car.
No, they don't. I mean,
then why should they get organized and do anything against it?
I don't know if anyone likes like going and driving around for 3 hours during rush hour. I mean, it's like
claims.
No. I'm saying that there are small potentials that could come out of these occupied spaces of capital. I'm just, is what I'm saying.
You never know what people are gonna like. I saw an ethnography at the last NCA where they were talking about how apps that on Uber and Lyft will do these reminders to the driver, like you're not driving, and they're like, hey, remember, you gotta work this many hours, and if you cross this threshold, then you start getting your bonuses. And they like interviewed all these drivers, and they're like, yeah, I love getting these updates. It keeps me on track.
Really?
It's like, what?
It's like people voluntarily wear these watches
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
have the
Yeah.
on.
That takes the data when they're sleeping
Yeah.
to make it productive.
That's
Oh.
exactly what I mean when they say when you don't realize that you labor, you're exploited, and you imagine that you realize yourself, the power of self-actualization.
What did Benjamin say about divine violence? It's always about space, right? Like you find a space and then a little space of autonomy within a totally saturated space, and then you defend it with violence. That's the one time you can use violence. It's all spatial, though. And it's spatial, occupying spaces of already, right, captured.
That's where we put the rest of it in
Well, yeah, it was joy. So I was also thinking about Frederick Lord Doan's book, Willing Slaves of Capital, and where he says, like, right, so what happened was, the joyful affects associated with consumption ended some time ago, right? And so the move was then love one's work, right? So you find little bits of, oh, yeah, I get a little attention, a nice reminder, I don't have to think about it, to, again, they kind of love what you do as just an ongoing mantra for oneself, to get up and have, what was that thing? It was, I think, in that same article, thank God it's Monday, right? The idea of like, that the young people are, people are like, thank God it's Monday. I love my work, right? So at what point does that though reach a limit, right? And so we can find it, I mean, and people have to get themselves to work, right? So it's the social reproduction of the self in that moment, and so why not love? But at some point, passionate love in the sense of Spinoza says, right? It's like at some point, this is something compelling me to joy. It's like it's an external, that it does not come from within. It's still my relationship to the power to be affected, and is not actually aligned with my power to act necessarily.
And I mean, he says, what's the most useful thing to a human? It's another human.
Another human.
Right? So it's that sense.
So it's back to that face to face.
Yeah.
But when the thing is the human, who cares about humans, right? As we learn from Kondo.
Yeah, well, this is why she's
And that's
so
the
perverse.
problem with her,
Right.
and that's why that's not revolutionary.
Well, and even that idea of, when I hear certain people say, I can't wait it's Mondays because they are, I hate to say it, they're sick of their children. Really, some of that is that the labor of the weekend, right? It's like, I would rather this labor than that labor because that labor's driving me crazy, right? And so,
Well, I think anyone with kids remembers
again,
when you
like
get to go up
thinking
into
that-
your job and your spouse or somebody else is watching your kid and you're like, oh my God, I love work.
Yeah.
And that's when I just sit at your desk and go, oh, it's quiet, I'm going to do my own stuff.
yes, because sometimes the most work I do is on the weekends.
So you think it's,
Or what I think of as work, right? I mean, maybe that's, whatever.
so do you think, I was thinking the same thing, because I have 3 kids, and I remember when before I finished my degree, I had 3 kids, and I would go to work as an assistant professor, and my clients would say, you're always happy. I'm like, I'm at home.
That's a slightly different model, but yeah.
Well, no, but that's how I felt, it was that
There is
I
those
come here and,
moments.
like, I don't have to wipe anybody's butt, right? So I wonder, like, is there an inherent danger to really expecting to love anything that you have to do too much? Do you know what I mean? Whether, no matter who it serves, that there's a, that love can possibly be a trap in any context, right? Because, I could love my job when it gets me away from my kids, and then I could love my kids when it gets me away from my job, but to feel like,
Larry Kando says it's a comparison.
well, I'm not sure that
Spectrum
my
of
kids
joy.
would always win. But I mean, like, what, is there a danger
So if
to
you're feeling
thinking,
bad, always look for something worse.
I don't know, or is love always a trap, I guess is what I'm saying, right? No matter whether it's you're loving your job or you're we all know, for example, like the whole idea about nursing, right? Oh, you're supposed to love doing this, and if is any time we feel connected to something because we're supposed to love it,
Hegemony, that's a theory of hegemony.
right? Right.
You
Yeah.
love the law.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's contingent on us to judge people's life satisfaction, right? I mean, they like what they like, and we have no privileged position to judge what they should like. But I think our value,
that's a
the
good
question
question.
is, what value are you getting the value for what you have Do you have decision-making processes? Right? Are you destroying your environment? Like, so if you like pressing a button every day and you get off on it, go for it.
That's
right?
like assuming that people are making choices before they do these things.
Well,
that's just not the way it is.
You
don't go out in the world and say, I want to do X. What the best we can do, and something I tell my students is, you might get to say no to things. Like, I will not work for Duke Energy and just like pollute the hell out of southern Indiana where we have the highest cancer rate. I will say no. I like doing technology engineering, but I won't work at Honeywell because I don't necessarily want to make drones that kill people in the Middle East. That's about the most we get to choose. Who gets to choose for sure? I think about choice. I want to do this. My autonomy
talking about choice
is going to be. Well, you're talking about choice. You're saying that we shouldn't judge people. We should allow for people to like whatever it is they might like.
Yes. And if they like it, they never had a choice and they still like it. It's not for you to judge that you should like something else. Where did you get a privileged position to tell people?
But you brought up the idea that people here, that somebody in some way is already judging other people for doing something.
We're saying that's not a real like. That they're liking it because someone else produced it for them. That's not. You can't start from that position. Like we can help them improve their ability to make choices, their ability to get out of that. Like, but that's their choice.
Who's they and who's helping? This is. I mean, I think the whole discourse. I feel like you're.
Oh, so the assumption in this room is that it is impossible to love your work genuinely. That's what we're hearing. Is that fair?
It's a compliment. I think that I would say those.
You just say we're questioning the imperative.
Still work.
No, I'm not hearing that you
doing
say.
it for money. Like
No,
the question is, would you do
May I
it
finish?
if you didn't have to get paid? Like I wouldn't go to work if I didn't.
You would come to work.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
But Lordon would say you have to renegotiate those aspects from work to co-literalization with the social. And that was Lordon's out of this idea of the problem of the desire that we're forced to love our work, right?
Right. So if your desires, so it's not necessarily just judging people for their desires. It's saying, well, first of all, it's an empirical question, but also the empiricism is a little, it's not known that we just say people like what they like. If somebody says fentanyl sparks joy in them, are we just going to say, well, okay, now you have pleasures? Well, okay, but that's a position to take. If you've got that position, then no one, it's not even judging. It's like, what is the connection people make? If it's just like a bunch of individual pleasures relativized in the world, then that's a world you imagine, and if you want to defend that world, you can't. I think what's happening here is that people aren't going to presume, unless it's an organizing moment. I agree with you that like we shouldn't be beginning with the position of judging everyone because they haven't reached a certain standard of awareness or about their own pleasures. But I think the work that we do as engaged beings and as friends, recognize even as friends, right? Do you have friends who have behavior like, I'm not so sure if that's good for you, even if you say it's good for you, but what do you do? Do you just say, well, again, nice pleasure, or do you want to intervene in a way that engages in a kind of relinear or re-socializing it? So I can find ways of a starting point, but then the reason is, what point do we just let go and relativize it?
That's Plato, right? Good and bad pleasures.
So I have an 8-year-old, and he that uses his leisure to make YouTube videos. His best friends are YouTubers, these social influencers.
I'm 12-year-old, so I'm like,
It's really okay.
Okay, so organizing your kids.
Don't judge what you have to do right now in this world.
All the free labor he does. It's like, and also his YouTube influencers, they're like old school TV that's slow. Like he has a real social relationship with them. Like he's cracking up. He can't wait to see what Auntie Dan's doing right now, or Stampy, or.
And one of the things we noticed when it first happened was like, you were prepared to resist the screen so much, but these obviously on the one hand, for any of these YouTube people to do kid programming, they one become really good at it, and two, they can't actually produce problematic stuff because all of their money, which they make a ton of crazy money, depends on them not using swear words and not being offensive because they're actually being forced to become children's programmers. right? And on the other hand, what I noticed was this is not what I would imagine 15 years ago when everything was produced by Disney and it was hyper cuts and it was like a corporate boardroom and they were using it as to also, you know, with product placement, that these are long form, weird, somewhat independently produced stuff. Not to say that they're better, but there was a quality to them that seemed legitimately kind of, I don't know, it was not what I expected. And but it's also at the same time just like a radically new experience of subjectivity in relationship to media that watching it right now is just shocking. And I don't know what to do, and I don't think it's necessarily horrible because they're gonna have to negotiate this space that's pure screens, this kid's right now. Like there's gonna be no like, I don't know where the negotiations are gonna be, but it's unfolding now. You know?
Well, what specifically? Screens? So,
Like what's like in your world, how do these things get discussed?
just to make sure.
Just this
kind of cars.
just this the technology
Right.
things that
And what do you mean by your world?
Yeah.
his academics area of study.
Yeah. So I think there's and it's reached some levels. I'm sorry, he's wrong. But so many words are now modifying labor. There's aspirational labor, hope labor, digital labor. The ones I mentioned here: entrepreneurial labor, aesthetic labor. Right. So
Lazy labor.
that's right. Refusal of all those labor. No, but okay. So what does it say though? It's a pedagogic moment too. So we talk about this sometimes with our students. It's like, okay, at one point we tell students, you're going on. It's pleasure for you, and it's interaction and sociality. But guess what? Data extraction. Somebody's making money. They're like, okay, yeah, and what? That's like I'm getting this space to be to have friends, to have joy, to laugh, to make things. So I think the layer of saying like when you're online, you're laboring. I think the best route that probably has gone to is like the universal basic income. But even that is like questionable, right? It's just like we're all producing value. So start with the social income and then figure other things out. So there's that version of it tied to it. But I think there's, for me at least, I mean, I find it interesting to look at those moments of reproduction, social reproduction, and the exhaustion of those. And that so much of this depends on a youthful exuberance and enthusiasm and energy that, like we've known with certain kinds of startup labor and dot-com booms, they target 20-somethings because you can exhaust them after a few years, and then what, right? What do you do with the results of extraction of youth energy? So I think, I mean, again, that's not exactly hopeful, but it's a tendency to look.
What came to my mind, the response is what you do is you destroy revolutionary potential. You exhaust them language and...
Oh, right. That's the...
We're looking for those moments.
Right.
But if you are exhausted, I look at myself.
Are people aware of the political economy, of the political polarization of social media? The buck side of it?
Say that again?
Why it's in Facebook's interest to have politically polarized speech? Is that commonly understood in this room?
Can you repeat?
The political economy of politically polarized speech on Twitter or Hatebook, is that dynamic generally understood in the room is my question. Why Facebook wants it?
Why Facebook wants what?
Politically polarized extreme speech. This is not a different question.
I'm not sure what, yeah.
So obviously, they're selling all the data. So they want as much streams of communication as possible. Individuals typically like more responses. You're trying to start a thread that gets a whole lot of conversation. It's rewarding. What we now know is that the thing that will get the most responses and launch the most extensive threads is extreme political speech. So it's in the interest of a Twitter and a Facebook to allow extreme political polarization and hate speech and all of the other things that have gone along with it because of the economic value to them of that.
So basically what you're saying is that extreme political speech is yet another commodity.
I'm saying that when you are online thinking and enjoying your leisure, which these days for a lot of people is slamming people politically, that you are also still feeding the profit mechanism.
Absolutely.
So I want to make sure Ron gets a little bit of time to talk. How long do you want? I was gonna try and.
Enough to go to the
Yeah, so we need a bathroom break.
5
Who
minutes.
knows, man? It depends if the spirit moves me.
You're taking no responsibility for the length
Yeah,
of this thing.
yeah, it's a Quaker kind of thing, right? But I mean, okay. Let me have 15 minutes.
Yeah,
Let me see if
let's take a
that's
bath.
what I
Let's
need.
take a break. Let's reconverge a little after 45 after.
Do we
take
need
10
to get out of here by 5 though? Is that the
We
goal?
need to get out of here by 5.
Oh, I think we've got some space.
Okay.
There's no one coming in to take us out.
Even if they do walk out the doors.
You never see how close they lock you in. And they'll lock you in. And you get people just like, Just this year in Colorado, and it was very bizarre, like they will lock us in, but like, and it was like 7 or something, but it was like, we have to, so it was just, and I said, and her friend was looking at us, like, we're like, we cannot start late, we have to get people out, you know, so it was like, a ton of questions, and I was nervous the whole time. Yeah, come on, girl, we go now. Get dinner.
Well, then we have 13 minutes of tape time left.
That's all I need, right?
I sure hope so.
I got you.
And I always put this idea like this is for humans to and he uses like Antonioni's 70s films, Red Desert. Like these humans are like, and for me it's like, okay, here's that corridor of where like the huge car lines go, and there's all that like fieldy space. And it's like those spaces, right, are already like so but there's also no regulation. It's like a weird, awesome. Like regulated, located like capital spaces, but then also it's always about breaking them. Where are those spaces? Yeah, where are the clearly people like where the other folks hang out in the city.
Okay. Oh, good.
Like
And I'm sure they can.
Where
I
are
don't
these
think
spaces? Surveillance and already so the prisons feel spaces of flow, weird zones.
Life is what's dignified. It's just like air life. Yeah. Because the fun is to be able to connect on scale. It's not there's enough stage.
I was gonna say there's definitely.
But we have to be better at like hacking things. Like if Big Scout becomes algorithms, then how about we just like somebody breaking a lift and then you just tweak it so like all of a sudden all the workers get an extra 40% before anyone realizes it, right? Like that would be a revolutionary reorganization of fixed capital. I barely do that personally, but maybe my kid can.
I'll go for 30 minutes tape time. 30 minutes should get me. Literally have a video recording every day this
In that
week.
case, an organization of space to control actually produces an opportunity for
Oh no.
sound
To be honest, Mark, fuck. I know why I call you Mark. You look like a friend. I've been Mark for years. No. Sorry, Michael. Right. So they didn't know it was fine. Sorry. No, I have
What's
the Mexican one? Like the 64 gigs, so it can hold 150 units. You sit down and you
It's the
finish.
name of the platform.
And that's the tough
It's
part.
Amazon
He doesn't really,
owned.
this time on
They do it on the same point of view. So it's an actual platform.
It's just a way of making micro gigs on the base signs. I like this idea that it's like, that technically in a way, there should be some technology.
Yeah, we feel like we have to learn. Yeah,
And that's what I'm talking about. Like, here,
Children, whatever it is, spouse, you don't have to learn anything.
and it's mechanized labor, and that's a whole, and how do you reproduce a capitalist society where there's
I know,
They're loving it as the same thing as liking.
and that's how radical inequality has a more
we'll see.
other than just the accumulation of capital by 1% of the population, but to actually produce a different kind of surplus populace that would be and also adding this complicated dynamic where it's not just even happening. You're doing your own computers, right? You're not going to an office all day at night going around computers on the floor, right? It's rent. Okay, this stuff, so all the fixed capital costs, right, are occupied, and then you don't have to displace off the worker, and that's, I mean, it's like playing my own arguments, it's like that's true. To me, that's something interesting. Why do you have this distinction?
But how are they different from design garment work, right? Where you have people in their homes doing, you know what I mean, like,
There's always been that, right? This is why there's like, and even in manufacturing, when Marx was manufacturing, he's talking about just like getting 8 people, he says, you get 8 people in the same room making the same thing, even if each of them makes the entire belt buckle or whatever, it still is more efficient, it still produces more surplus value because they can like share the tools and there's all these efficiencies. So on the one hand, piecework is inefficient unless the people are so, right, that you're not even gonna.
Do you think it's still showing, or is it just so like, do they black out the screen?
I think there is, like, I think
Oh.
that's the way that piecemeal
The
works.
stream's still going.
At least in
Okay.
some areas, is that you have families who are all working together in their homes.
I just think that is because that's like such an advanced form of, such a excessive
Oh,
form of exploitation that to bring it back in a modern way is not the same. It's not like just going back. It's like it's bringing it's both the past and the future simultaneously. And because if you're on the Lower East Side and you're Jewish, Eastern European, and you have to roll cigars 20 hours, that's what they said about the lift. The lift didn't change the aggregate so that in the last 6 months they looked more profitable, and so they lowered the ability for people to make money. So the woman said, you have to work 12 hours a day, 6 days a week to make a living, which before took 6 to 7 or 8 hours 6 days a week, and now it's up to 12 to 14. And it's like, well, if you're free to work whenever you want, as long as it's 6 days a week, 14 hours a day, then it changes. It's not just wage labor anymore either, because it stops being a bubble hour. It starts being it's like all these old functions being brought back.
Things you talk about how you
Yeah.
have to bring.
And you have no choice.
Right, well, and you have
Just like
to
the old
bring your
days.
laptop, right, one of the big ones in the uprising of the 20,000 was you don't have to bring your own sewing material.
Exactly.
We will buy your
That's
materials.
but this is what I'm saying. This is exactly right? Because we had to bring your own stuff, you had to do piecework, and you didn't have any regulation on whether it took 8 or 20 hours a day. It's like take it or leave it. But that's what I'm saying. So it's like these new modes, when they say, oh, we're just doing this new work, it's on a, that's what they say, we're not a transportation, but let's be clear. Uber and Lyft also say, we don't have to bring a handicapped accessible van to you because we're not a transportation company. We're not responsible for any of that.
Okay.
But it's no criteria. It's not so that's what it is. So it's new, it's old.
Okay. A little bit. For now, I just wanted to open the floor to general reflections, conversation about all across different papers. That can go for a little bit of time, maybe around 15 minutes, and then I will just have some very brief closing things to say after Ron, and that should hopefully give us a little bit of time before we have to eat dinner. So yeah, I really enjoyed talking with y'all and some of these exchanges. What did y'all think?
Well, this is the most I've talked about Marx
in a day, like a few years, so I thought it was kind of fun.
Yeah, that was awesome. Great company. A lot smarter than you.
Are there any? I just wondered if people had questions like across the papers or stuff y'all.
Oh, I see.
Like, it's kind of really general, non-specific Q&A.
It's a good conversation, 5 stars.
Yes, right.
My Lyft driver actually gave me a hug when she dropped me off at the airport.
Wow. That's dope.
And I don't know if it was part of the form of, you know, when you drop somebody off at the airport, you hug them? Or if, so does that happen to anyone else, or was it?
My daughter took an Uber in California, and then 2 weeks later, she got a bottle of very expensive perfume from the Uber driver. I opened it because she was at school, and it said that was the best 15 minutes of my life. I want nothing more from you, but I just want you to know that you made my day, my week, my month, my year.
I just got a hug.
Oh my God.
I know.
What did she
I'm not
do?
exaggerating a word of that. It was the best 15 minutes of his life.
What did she do? Do you
I
ask
know,
her?
what did she do?
Yeah, yeah.
Mom wants to know.
I don't want to know. I do not want to know. I mean, she says nothing. I sat in the back
No,
and
of
chatted.
course, yeah, chat.
But it was that, it was that face-to-face thing.
Yes,
that-
something happened.
Economy moment, yeah.
So one of the connections that I was trying to make in my head, that as someone who, well, first I want to, like a sidebar, as someone who doesn't identify as a Marxist or who isn't very well versed in Marxism, I love this because first I was like, wow, this is, it's surprising. Yeah, I can go on and on about it, but I thought this was great. But one of the things I was thinking about is kind of from the bookends of the today was to think about in terms of what Kate was talking about in terms of fixed capital, and a lot of times, you know, in the conversations that we would have, we would kind of revert to, again, that manufacturing or the workplace as traditionally understood when we talk about these terms. And I was like, okay, so what is the fixed capital of the house, the home? And then how do we think of those resistances and uses of fixed capital in that space? So how does that change, you know, if we really take seriously the feminist Marxist critique of thinking of the home as another space of work? Then how do these concepts then how do they do or not translate into that space? And I know her work on the Palestinian cementing of homes and stuff, it made me think of that as well, is what do we do with that? I don't have an answer, but in terms of like connections across, that's what I was thinking about as we were discussing even more.
And the space, right? The ways in which space could be used and used differently or taken over or resisted. There's a movement with senior living because there's no one to take care of old people. That is becoming much more communal. I've just seen a couple of, you know, Hunter Press articles about it, getting people to live together so they're not alone and to build that community, which redoes the home and redoes the space. You know, sign myself up. The Marxist old folks home. That's what we do.
They were just yelling at each other.
Forever. Damn Stalinist!
No, but you know, that reminds me of Sylvia's comments about Levittown, which by the way is like 2 minutes from Hofstra. You can see practically Levittown from our offices, so it's very proximate.
Yeah.
But this whole notion that like the old folks home, right, repurposing that, but then also just the idea of, you know, how we have conceptualized the home generally as this you know, we are all separate in our own homes. So I mean, how can we even reconceptualize home itself in both the abstract and in particular as a more communal site and a site of resistance and activism. There's actually a long history in the labor movement of repurposing houses.
I would like to know that. Or tent cities, like these are things I actually haven't researched, but they're becoming fascinating to me now.
That's one of the squats. And the
Yeah.
Squat,
Yeah.
I guess this is kind of a question for Kate that I didn't get to ask earlier. But it seems like the way that we've talked about place has been a lot in terms of kind of circulating strategies, the recipe for the Molotov cocktail, right? All of these things that kind of get transmitted and let people do stuff. But your example is super local. and like by design, it's designed to prevent people from communicating, and particularly outside of that site. So do you see this more as like a kind of capacity for resistance that comes out when people are in terrible conditions, or do you see this as kind of a product of strategies of transmission or circulation, or how would you kind of think about that question?
I think I have the same question, to be honest. This is something that I've kind of stewed on, like, right, because there is the sense in a prison or in other kinds of cramped spaces, like we talked about, like the car or whatever, right? You are separated from people, but you're also in really tight quarters with people at the same time. And so, like, what does that do to you, actually? And, like, what does that do to the kind of relations that you're actually able to produce if just, like, the tiniest thing shifts? And so I think that's kind of what I'm playing with, but yeah, I'm not sure.
One of the things, sorry, I was just going to follow with it because we'll talk about it in that conversation, is that it maybe speaks to that a little bit, or maybe I said it during Q&A, I'm repeating myself, about blockage. Is that just us?
Yeah.
Oh, Q&A, okay.
Where should the listen song?
Ron, would you like?
Oh,
Yeah,
sing
no,
song.
why don't you do it and you can do the end, you know, you can summarize.
Sing solidarity for us.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just wanted everyone to have a chance to talk some more, and I hope we'll take some time again tonight. I mean, one of the things that I think in the organizing this was the hope that and the goals of trying to have the conference itself live on in a collective way, all right? Whether or not that is to be thought about in terms of books or articles, or if it just meant to be staying in connection with one another as we share our work with each other, all of those were still open questions. But at least at the times that I talked to Matt May about this, there was some sense of giving ourselves this moment to recognize each other, to be a part of something that we may not know we have been a part of, but for a number of years now, whether those points of articulation, which it's one of those words I'll come back to in a minute, but whether those points of articulation were things happening in Minneapolis, or things that were happening at NCA, or things that were happening because of living in Texas, or different associations with different social movements, how through the last sort of 10, 15 years, Matt has been able to connect lots of different groups of people together, and to sort of to keep a talk and a conversation going. Because this conference in some ways was meant to, as I recall some of the early discussion of it, was meant to remind us that in a very profound sense, we're not alone. We've actually created something. There is a collective conversation going on about the value of Marx that is not the collective conversation that is often happening someplace else, right? And it has a lot to do with our willingness to read Marx in new and interesting ways, to keep Marx alive, to recognize the absences, if you will, the blindnesses of Marx, so that we can enter into new conversations and new sort of theoretical sort of conversations, to see in Marx his Spinoism, where other people may and still today refuse to see those connections. So my point is simply to reinforce the idea that we are actually that which we are hoping to come, if you will. We have been doing this together, and even if we haven't met each other face to face, we've been doing this for a long time together, and we've been reading each other together, and we've been talking to each other together, even if it was indirectly. And I think one of the hopes of this conference was that we will keep doing that beyond this particular room. And I wanted to emphasize, like Jack, when I began my first conversations with Matt May about this, it was these sort of passages, right? Was one of the ways that we might get into it. And I kind of wanted to share just really briefly a couple quick passages I think are relevant to some of the things that I want to talk about. I was going to talk about the chapter on cooperation in Marx. And to reinforce maybe a point that Jack was making, is that, here's a quick quote: "The work of directing, superintending, and adjusting becomes one of the functions of capital from the moment that the labor under capitalist control becomes cooperative. And in some ways, what I think this goes back to is the Negrian point, that cooperation is a precondition for social labor, or a variation on the trans-individuality of social production. And that cooperation is sort of one of those terms that we can use to describe this trans-individualization of social production. But it itself is, in fact, produced by labor and relationships with one another that in some ways becomes that which must be controlled, that which must be commanded. And in some sense, that sort of story that Negri speaks about is that there's always this potential of escape in that cooperation. And I think that's also meant for us, right? That is to say, we are here together to work with each other, to think about our cooperative relationships that sort of extend beyond whether or not they can be valued in particular direct ways that make particular sense to our vidas, or particular ways to our employers. Or to put it maybe in Kate's language, right, that we have been able to occupy this fixed capital, right, to have a conversation, to think differently, I think has been pretty important. I'd also like one other quick quote. Marx argues that the worker confronts the authority of capitalists as, quote, as a powerful will of being outside them, who subjects their activity to his purposes or authority in a form that is purely despotic. I'd like to say that is not how Matt Bost has run this cooperative. I've experienced him as despotic, and in fact, just the opposite, right? I think that's a point to Matt Bost, as this was organized, partly as sort of the desire of Matt May to get all of us together to sort of recognize our cooperative energies and our conversations. In many ways, this has happened because of Kevin Barge and Matt Bost keeping this thing going, right? Even in Matt May's health crisis, and so we are appreciative of them to sort of keep us going, keep this thing going, and to keep Matt's particular work as vital as it still is. So I just wanted to recognize that there are cooperative forms of interaction that I think we have embodied and enacted, as some of us in rhetoric say, and that those should be recognized as something we've done this week, this day, and we should keep that going. And thank Matt May, and to thank Matt Bost, and to thank Kevin Barge, and all of the folks here at Texas A&M that have made it possible for us to occupy this space. So thank you. One of the terms that I've been sort of struck with, maybe this has something to do with my Illinois moment, right? But that I haven't heard a lot here, is the word articulation. And the concept has perhaps it's lost a certain purchase, right? People seem to prefer entanglements these days. People tend to prefer subject relations these days, right? But articulation was one of those concepts that were meant just as much as entanglement is today to break through certain models of communicative interaction that presuppose certain models of intersubjectivity, so that it could hold on to the unique histories of different things that would come together at particular moments in time, whether of necessity or of contingency. And the reason why I also want to sort of remind us of that concept just for a second, and not just to sort of to defend it as as that term which we were using just 15, 20 years ago to stand in for another term that's popped up today, but to recognize that that term itself also came out of a particular debate in Marxism. And it was a particular debate that happened in places like the New Left Review over what do you do with this very question of the historical development of capitalism and the problem of the modes of production. And what do you do when capital does go global? It wasn't so much that capitalism is something that Bernard was telling us. It wasn't so much that capitalism just moved production to other places, but it rearranged those other places in particular ways that did not get rid of piecemeal production, or may not have gotten rid of handicraft, or may not have gotten rid of sort of certain forms of peasantry, for example, but kind of grafted themselves on top of it. That is to say, even both in the same place and in the same time, as well as across spaces, there were different modes of production going on at the same time. And the concept of articulation was meant to recognize, or one way in which that concept appeared was not to say that one trans-historical version of capitalism was the only form of capitalism, but to recognize that there was an organizing mechanism in which labor was organized and the way in which labor could organize, if you will. It's both an organizing metaphor, I need to talk to Kevin about this, versus the organization of labor, right? And those are two different things, right? And we've been talking about that a little bit this whole conference, right? We've been talking about, like, how do we organize to oppose a particular mode of organization, right? And part of having to recognize that in our time, and maybe we never fully realized it, or some of us in the Marxist tradition never fully appreciated it because we were sort of identifying with a particular kind of revolutionary subject, was to recognize that actually that revolutionary potential is escaping any one mode of production at any one moment of time, right? And so what I'm trying to suggest, just for a brief, quick moment, there was another term that came from Latin America, as Sylvia would know, right? This phrase of uneven development, right? So that capitalism was never, ever smooth. It's still not smooth. It participates in lots of uneven relationships. And it's perhaps possible to identify in these uneven relationships, or uneven, what was referred to as development, there's recognition of how this whole conversation today has been a discussion of all of that uneven development and all of that uneven production. I didn't really hear, I didn't really hear Cordella saying, it's all captured and there's nowhere to go. I was hearing Cordella say the structure has changed, right, of how we organize what we used to call surplus labor, so that it can be sort of intensified for certain purposes, and that would require us to think a little differently about strategy for action, or maybe just not to overrun my reading of Cordella's work, but just to suggest that we had a real serious conversation about the differential character of modes of production, the differential characters of labor, the differential character, think for example the difference between productive, unproductive, and reproductive labor. We had a long conversation about how these different forms of labor are being organized, and how in fact these different forms of labor become sites of organizing, both as a mode of class composition, but also of resistance to particular forms of their own organization, right? I will say this, though, for all that we talked about, and we did talk a little bit about the difference between manufacturing capital and service labor, right? We did talk about reproductive labor. We didn't talk a whole lot about finance capitalism, right? We didn't talk a whole lot about what is often referred to as fire plus healthcare. Finance, insurance, real estate, plus healthcare. And I don't know, right? Maybe we were, right? When we're talking about reproductive labor, and we were talking about healthcare, right? And we were talking about how that works. But in fact, the derivative, as a particular kind of commodification of time, for example, might be other places that we need to sort of keep our head around. That is, all the work we did to kind of make sure that we're trying to put all these different forms of labor and organizations in touch with each other. The one part that I thought we kind of, we could have spent a little bit more time on was, if you will, finance capitalism. But even I know when I say that, I'm talking about a lot of things, insurance, real estate, right? So for me, I would use this concept of articulation to try to think through how these different forms of labor interact with others, these different forms of organizing happen in each other. I would want to still figure out a way to think about finance capital and add that to our conversation. But I thought that was one of the things that we were doing, and we were doing very well, right? The other, to go back to sort of, the earlier part of the discussion, was some of the work that started popping up in our first discussions on on the home, and then that sort of led to a sort of longer discussion about reproductive labor itself, right? And the way in which that term belongs not just to the domestic sphere, qua-domestic sphere, but that term has relationships to social movements themselves, right? And the reproduction of social movements. And one of and even if you will, it comes back to Kate's later. And again, forgive me, I'm not going to be able to at this point go down, when Tyler said this is the connection. I can't quite pull that together right now. So I mean, no disrespect if I'm missing you, right? Please help me remember what happened. But there was this recognition, but like with Kate's stuff later, it was this emphasis on fixed capital in some ways as part of, and Bernard's point about, there's actually a crisis in social reproduction at the level of fixed capital, which we didn't even think about before. Or let me put it this way, right? I mean, capital doesn't even want to pay for its own infrastructure, right, anymore, right? Which probably comes back to finance capital, right? It doesn't even want to participate in its own investment, in its own ability to extract certain forms of social value. Or one of the ways I was also thinking about it in a good old Marxist way, they want to socialize the means of infrastructural production, right? In the name of a job, right? That is, the value of this is that if I give you the tax breaks, if I create the abatement, if I create the transportation, if I organize the sewage and everything else associated with our new football stadium, right, then you're going to produce X amount of jobs, right? And that's going to be valuable to us, right? Or it's going to be valuable to the community, right? And I'm not sure if I know what I really want to say there, except to suggest that perhaps the job, or to show off my own autonomous biases, right? Perhaps the job or the work isn't worth, right, letting them off the hook quite that easily on their own infrastructural investments, right? But tied to that, right, there's a missing piece again. Just like I didn't hear enough about finance capital, I wasn't going to talk about it either. Right? I was going to talk about soft skills and cooperative work that me and Kristen have been working on together. But one of the things I didn't quite hear us then talk about is the state form. Right? And it's hinted at in a lot of our work today, right? And that the relationship between capital and the state is a complicated relationship. It's not one or the other. It can articulate itself to despotic regimes just as well as it can articulate itself to democratic, right, modes of state formation. It's rather promiscuous in its relationship to state forms. It just wants state forms to help it maximize its capital investment, right? It doesn't need democracy, right? But the point I'm trying to make is that, and this is a Sylvia concept, right, is that we were all recognizing this as the crisis of social reproduction, but the crisis of social reproduction is partly articulated to the crisis of a state form of welfare that, at least in the United States, was pretty thin, to be sure, right? But we all know in this room, even those thin values that were brought to us by the New Deal are in fact the very things now under assault, right? And these might be parts of, while I'm sure we're looking for new strategies, there may be ways in which, we can take this crisis of social reproduction and think differently about how we can sort of create alternative strategies. Not so much maybe that we're looking for I think I was hearing Cordell or someone else say, not so much that we're looking for the state to take care of us, but to find new cooperative relationships that could force the state to act in different ways and to form in different ways, right? So, crisis of social reproduction is also a conversation to have about the state form in which we're living and how that state form is allowing for certain relationships to capital to sort of be magnified as opposed to other ones, and often in the name of a job, right? Then the last part, I'll just reinforce something that I'm pretty sure Karina was talking about, which is, and it is a something that kind of came back with Sylvia as well. I think sometimes we get, I have been trying, maybe poorly, right? And not so much to highlight my own work. But I never found, as well as I wanted, this structure agency thing to work very well for rhetoric, right? Basically because I've never thought that supposedly rhetoric was always going to be on the side of agency, and therefore rhetoric was sort of almost given these magical powers that it was going to be able to sort of negotiate and challenge all of the things that are making it difficult for us to live our lives in more humane and cooperative ways. But so for that, what that meant for someone like me is that, I mean, call it all agency if you want, or call it social forces, right? Recognize they're all collective, right? It's all structure in some particular way. But I do think that this conference has reminded me, if I don't like structure and agency, I do need structure and strategy, right? That may still be an important distinction, right? And to think through how, because that gets us back to organizing, right? And again, I'm willing to use it in a broader, I think I'm aligning myself with a certain thread in organizational communication that wants to think about communication as an organizing force and not one that just thinks of communication as maintaining that which is the organization, right? But I would also mean organizing labor in traditional senses, organizing labor in all these other new senses in which we've talked about. We don't have an answer quite yet, but we have the question, right? And the question is, how do you create strategic opportunity, or how do you sort of try to maximize strategic potential out of certain kinds of structures that work to try to maximize surplus value, right? And so how can we, in new ways that haven't existed in the past, right? That is, how do we find ways to sort of, if you will, bring back collective interactions or intra-actions when in fact, right, we used to have a certain kind of factory that allowed that to happen, but now we have less and less of that, right? Where are the aggregations of bodies that can allow for some of this to happen? So I do think we have a new strategic question, right? Is how to get people together, right? And part of that is being driven by a structure that does disaggregate as much as it aggregates us. Right? Those are just sort of like, I do think this sort of idea about different ways of doing labor and different ways of doing modes of production, and how those, for me, are modes of articulation, that we were doing that really well. I do think the crisis of social reproduction and this question of strategy and structure, I think, really sort of informed a lot of our discussion. So thank you for allowing me to be the one to sort of try to wrap some things up, but I appreciate it. Thanks to Matt. Thanks to Jeff.
Ron, I love the strategy of structure. It brings me back to structure and feeling. There's really something there. You gotta theorize it.
So I'll be pretty brief. I just wanted to say a couple things to kind of close out the conference, and then give a really brief, kind of more academic coda, but not anything like a fully developed argument. So primarily, I just want to say kind of thank yous to many of the people involved. In particular, thank you to Kevin for the time and resources and energy you put into this project and into making the space happen and the project happen. To all of the folks in the department that did work for things to happen, Sandra Maldonado, Ruby Ruiz, Orrin Adams, all the folks who kind of facilitated getting everyone here, putting the space together, setting up communications, to the folks who facilitated communications. I would like to say a really hearty and earnest thank you. Thank you to Jess for talking with us throughout the process and working to make things happen. to the grad students who've helped out, Kate and Tyler. Y'all have both been really invaluable, both in terms of keeping momentum for the project going and just in terms of, again, kind of helping facilitate the conversations and being a great part of those conversations. In terms of all the folks in the room, thank y'all for coming. I really enjoyed the conversation. I don't often get to do stuff like this anymore, and it was fantastic fun to talk with all of you, and especially also to the folks that dropped through, the other department faculty members and other people who took their time to come listen to us and engage with us today. So to move forward, I just have a couple of more concrete things. The first thing is that I would just echo what Ron said initially. I would very much like this to continue in some form. Matt and I think many of y'all know, had initially envisioned this turning into an edited volume. I think obviously projects have drifted, people's interest, right? People might have brought other things that they weren't working on a year ago, and that's completely fine. But I do very much want to see where people's interest is at and try and make something happen that's commensurate to, you know, what we had, the conversations that we had today. So I will be in touch soonish about that just to gauge interest and see what people are up for. And then I will try and kind of work with y'all relative to how you respond, and that might mean a special issue, that might mean an edited volume, that might mean something more like an exchange of ideas that happens longer term, just to see what folks are interested in. I would also say, just to close out, a couple of other things. I don't know where the card got to, but if you haven't signed the card for Matt, please take a minute to do that. And then I will be in touch soon about a GoFundMe page. Chris and I initially kind of started talking about this to get some money together to replace Matt's iPad because it got stolen. But long term, I think anything that folks can do to be supportive would be great. And so I will also be in touch with that within the next few days as soon as I can get that set up. So thank you all. I'm looking forward to dinner. I just want to close, and I'm sure you all are all too. And I really just mean I'm looking forward to talking with y'all more and kind of rounding the night out in a little bit more of a relaxed way and kind of getting to know folks better that I don't know. I just quickly wanted to close out though with, I guess, something of a tribute and something of a kind of brief academic gesture. So when we first started planning the conference, Matt and I had intended to continue work that we had thought about in terms of Marx's 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. That's a really complicated text, and so I'm not going to do anything like a detailed reading of it, but I just want to pick up a couple of threads to try and kind of get at some of the spirit of the day. So the earlier, for folks that don't know, right, the 18th Brumaire tracks how in the space of the few years, France went from a kind of broadly open, somewhat representative government to Napoleon's nephew first being elected president and then taking power in a dictatorial coup, right? So thinking about kind of how absolute power can emerge out of representative processes or parliamentary processes. This has been applied to lots of different historical examples, and we plan to continue the project that we had already done to extend it to think about Donald Trump. And just to kind of think about a few questions there, I think one thing that Marx is concerned to do that we really wanted to pick up on is avoid an account that either just says this is totally structural, this could have been anyone, this is just kind of capitalism grinding on, right? For him, Napoleon's nephew Louis is symptomatic. There are particular things that made him a fit for what happened, right, and positioned him structurally in a particular way. And on the other hand, he wanted to give a structural account, right, to avoid individualizing kind of political developments too much. On the other hand, there are some kind of really intuitive comparisons to Trump, right? Napoleon, or Louis Napoleon, is someone who a lot of people considered, Marx's words were, a buffoon, right? No one really took him seriously until he was kind of on the political stage, and then he was able to position himself or be positioned to take really kind of fairly direct control over France in a way that lots of people didn't see coming. I think another notable point of comparison is the deployment of spectacle, right? So the essay is really about how kind of representation and materiality end up really mixed up, right? So things happen like, right, the working class play a really direct role in the 1848 revolution and then are kind of gradually filtered through the representational system and marginalized. ideographs or kind of order words like order, law and order, right, are used to kind of marginalize more active leftist groups and exclude them from those processes. Different kinds of coalitions take place in Parliament, and basically the result of all this different wrangling is out of the chaos, right, emerges emerges Louis Napoleon, right? Etienne Balibar remarks that the 18th Brumaire is one place where the kind of more simplistic narrative that many people will have about Marx just isn't tenable, right? There aren't 2 classes or 3 classes. There are really complex layers of class composition that cut across lots of areas of life. And so Marx is concerned to kind of explain those. It's also a terribly depressing text. There's basically no space, right, for anything to be different. Marx is, I think, pretty personally kind of hurt by this, right? Because, well, I mean, for a variety of reasons. But right, it's, I mean, there's not really air or open space or kind of possibility in the text. And so we did a little work to think about rhetorical trope in the text, to think about how Marx uses a kind of logic of metonymy, to think about all these different substitutions, how certain interests or symbols are substituted for other interests or symbols, and kind of how that process accumulates over these few years. And then to think about the beginning and the end of the text, and how Marx uses chiasmus to think about these moments of really stark tension and try and pull contradictions out of these kinds of really shifty political processes that might be bigger picture moments where strategic political intervention either would have been possible in the past or might end up being possible. And one of the only kind of positive notes is at the very end, Marx, has these very prophetic words that anticipate the Paris Commune, that one day the statue of Napoleon will be toppled from the top of the Vendôme column, which happens a few years later. So I won't belabor the comparison to Trump, but I just wanted to give y'all a sense of kind of what we had been thinking about. And I think that this gets at one of the frames that I would like to take away from the conference. And so I want to put that kind of summary in conversation with a quote from one of Matt's most recent essays. So Matt writes, Jacques Derrida fondly remembered Gilles Deleuze as a thinker above all of the event, and quote, always of this event here, cet événement-ci. The singularity of the event, its thisness, consists of the difference it introduces into the set of all the possible outcomes given in a particular situation. While the event releases an irreducible difference for itself, an unavoidable interference in the so-called condition of possibility, the specificity of the event, again, its thisness, consists of the corporeal potentialities that unfold in the breach of the actual. So in that essay, which is also a tribute of a certain kind, Matt is writing about rhetorical criticism and basically the power of kind of enacting things to produce surplus, whether that's a surplus of meaning over a text that we're reading, right, that seems kind of airtight and locked in, whether that's a political surplus in a moment that seems very defeated, right, and like there's not much hope there. But I would just draw attention to especially the last part of this, right, the specificity of the event, its thisness, right. That's not a concept of really kind of open potentiality or difference. It's able to admit of small, really productive contradictions in places that might seem like they don't have a lot of open space or a lot of productive opening for change or difference. So by way of maybe gesturing at what we might have come up with, if we had had a little bit more time to talk about it, I guess that would be a takeaway from the conference for me, is right, I think the Brumaire and some of this work gestures at how you can take a text that is very sealed, airtight, not a lot of room for hope, right, or kind of redemption, and find little moments, specifically in the enactment and the talking and kind of the conversations that we've all had for the past few hours, and hopefully in kind of future organizing or other kinds of work that everyone in this room might do to create at least the possibility of things being productively different. So thank you all for coming. We have a reservation for dinner in about an hour, a little over an hour. So I'm happy. I will take some folks back to the hotel. We can find ways to get everyone a little bit of time to rest. And then once we're back, we'll meet at about 6:15 in the lobby. Do you think that's enough time for folks that know where this is? Is that from the hotel at 6:30? Oh, yeah, 6:15. Okay, cool. 6:20? So this morning, I think we had 3 cars, so I can take about 6 people. So if there are a couple more people who have room, that would be great. Okay, great. So yeah, we can coordinate that and give folks a kind of rest, refresh themselves from the conference, and then we'll convene around 6:15, 6:20 in the hotel lobby, and we'll head to dinner. Thank you all.
Turns out, yeah.
I gotta stop looking.
I know. I can't.